Spring had barely begun in the plains of Montana, but the cold still bit like it was January. The wind blew low, carrying the damp smell of snow that refused to melt. The women's prison camp remained motionless, as if time had frozen there along with the earth. It was still dawn when the metallic sound of the gate latch broke the silence. The women were already up, many of them awake since 4 in the morning, as they were every day. Their bodies had learned to get up before the whistle blew, to put on the same rough coat and boots that never dried completely. Outside, the dirt courtyard awaited, covered with a thin layer of ice that made their footsteps crunch. An American guard appeared at the watchtower. His voice, hoarse and hesitant, echoed across the empty field. "No work today. It's Easter." The words floated for a few seconds before disappearing into the frosty air. The prisoners did not react. They stood still, as if they had not understood. The silence that followed was thick, the kind you can hear inside your bones. The guard frowned, adjusted his coat, and repeated, now more slowly, gesturing with his hands, "No work. Easter Sunday." A young woman, her face covered with a faded scarf, translated quietly to the group, "No work today. It's Easter." Even so, no one moved. The announcement seemed like a provocation. It had been months since those women from different cities in Germany had been transported to that remote corner of the United States. They worked cutting wood, cleaning the soldiers' quarters, washing pots until the skin on their fingers cracked open in small wounds. Routine was the only certainty left. And now, a soldier was saying it was Easter. Some exchanged suspicious glances. Others pretended not to hear. Easter was a word that had lost its meaning. Faith had been left behind, along with the letters that never arrived, with the families that might no longer exist. For those who lived on rations and memories, the calendar was nothing more than a distant rumor. Even so, the guard insisted. He gestured toward the mess hall, from which emanated a yellowish, almost welcoming light. The sound of a door slamming inside sounded muffled, and for a moment no one knew if it was an invitation or a trap. It was then that one of the oldest women, a former factory supervisor from Dusseldorf, crossed her arms and spoke without looking at anyone. "Let's wait. Let's see what it is." She said this in the same voice she had used before the war, when she coordinated workers and machines. Her authority was natural, discreet, but a younger woman, her eyes lively despite her fatigue, raised her head and murmured, "There's something different today. I can smell it." The air did indeed carry an unexpected scent, something warm, slightly sweet, that clashed with the usual smell of grease, smoke, and cheap soap. It was the kind of smell that awakened involuntary memories: bread in the oven, melting butter, childhood. None of them dared to comment aloud, but it was impossible not to notice. The guard, impatient, gave a final wave and walked away. The sound of his boots crushing the ice faded in the courtyard, and the iron gate closed behind him with a sharp bang. The women were left alone, surrounded only by the wind. For a moment no one moved. The habit of obedience fought against curiosity. The idea of Easter seemed as absurd as it was dangerous. After so long living between fences and orders, a day without work sounded like something that needed to be earned or paid for. Inside the barracks the air was heavy, smelling of wet wool and tired bodies. One of the women coughed, and the sound echoed like a reminder that they were alive. A metal mug rolled and hit the iron bed, breaking the tense silence. Outside, the sky was turning the color of old iron, and the wind was announcing more snow. It was then that the woman from Dusseldorf moved. Without saying a word, she began to walk slowly toward the dining hall. The sound of her footsteps on the frozen ground made the others turn around. 1, 2, 5, 15 women followed her. They walked hunched over in their gray coats, with their patched skirts, worn shoes, and hair tied up any which way. They looked like shadows moving in the cold morning light. As they got closer, the smell got stronger. It was unmistakable now. Roasted meat, butter, something slightly citrusy. The women looked at each other, speechless. The smoke coming out of the cafeteria chimney had a different tone. It wasn't the smell of the usual thin porridge. When they reached the door, they hesitated. Through the window they could see the Americans moving back and forth, setting plates, arranging tables covered with white tablecloth, and small green branches. It was an impossible scene. Everything there was out of tune with what they knew. The brightness of the light, the calmness of the movement, the absence of haste. The soldiers seemed to be preparing for a party. The prisoners' hearts were racing, and a mixture of fear and confusion took hold of them. No propaganda, No speech they had heard in Germany before their capture had prepared their minds for something like this. The enemy did not offer flowers, bread, or warmth. Suddenly the door opened. An American sergeant appeared, young, clean-faced, without the harshness one would expect from a man of war. He smiled, a simple gesture but so out of context that it seemed like a trap. He gestured with his hand, inviting them in. None of them moved immediately. Then he repeated, now in a softer, almost shy voice, "Please, come in." The heat that escaped through the door hit the women's faces like a shock. The contrast between the bitter cold and the warm air in the hall made them shiver. The first step into the cafeteria was like crossing an invisible border. The wooden floor creaked under their damp boots. The sound was almost intimate, and for a moment it seemed as if even the wind outside had stopped to watch. Inside, everything was light. The lamps hanging from the ceiling were lit, casting a yellowish glow over the tables covered with clean white tablecloths. In the center of each was a small pine branch tied with red string. The Americans moved between the tables, arranging cutlery and adjusting napkins. There were no shouts, no orders, just calm, coordinated gesture. The prisoners looked around suspiciously. The last thing they expected was a gesture of humanity. Some hugged their arms to their bodies, as if they could protect what little dignity they had left. Others just watched, trying to understand. The smell was almost unbearable now. Roast meat, potatoes, something sweet and toasted. One of the soldiers, wearing a flour-stained apron, brought a tray. He spoke in English quietly, almost apologizing for not being understood. The translator approached and whispered, "He said to help yourselves. There is food for everyone." The women looked at each other. The impossible was before them. None of them carried weapons. No gestures of violence, no harsh words, just food, and warmth, and light. The woman from Dusseldorf took a deep breath. The air smelled of melted butter and something old, memories that no longer fit into the world they lived in. For a moment, she thought about retreating, but something inside her, perhaps hunger, perhaps the need to believe that humanity still existed, made her take a step forward. That would be the first step of all, an almost trivial gesture, but one that, over the course of the day, would cause dozens of prisoners of war to begin to doubt everything they had been taught about the enemy. And that, for a few hours, the fences, the towers, and the war itself would seem distant, as if the winter of the soul had finally begun to melt. The interior of the dining hall seemed to belong to another world. The heat escaping from the radiators mixed with the steam rising from the trays and formed a light mist, gilded by the light of the lanterns hanging from the ceiling. The prisoners entered silently, hesitantly, their eyes moving from one detail to another, trying to understand what they were seeing. The tables were covered with smooth, unblemished white linen tablecloths, and each had a small sprig of pine tied with a red ribbon. It was a symbolic, almost domestic touch, such a stark contrast to the harshness of the camp that some women stopped at the entrance, unable to take another step. The American soldiers were there, moving between the tables, but without the authoritarian tone they knew. No shouting, no sharp orders. There were only restrained gestures, kind looks, and the sound of plates being carefully set. A young sergeant, the same one who had called them at the door, stood waiting, his hands in his pockets, as if he didn't want to pressure them. His face was pale and his eyes showed a kind of inexperienced kindness, a rare trait to find amid uniforms and discipline. The first move came from the cook, a large man with gray hair and a flour-stained apron. He waved to the group and said something in English, his voice hoarse but cordial. The young translator, who had been a teacher in Leipzig before the war, translated in a low voice. He said to help yourselves. There is enough food for everyone. For a moment, no one believed it. The prisoners looked at the platters arranged on the metal counter, and what they saw seemed like a memory from another time. A whole turkey, golden, glistening in the light, its skin cracked where the juice had dripped. Mountains of mashed potatoes, still steaming, with small pools of melted butter on top. Glazed carrots, green beans with sliced almonds, a dark sauce that looked thick and fragrant. And next to it, baskets of golden bread rolls, small, soft, covered with egg glaze. A woman stepped forward, reached out, and touched the edge of a tray, just to make sure it was real. The steel was warm. She felt the vibration of something alive, the clatter of spoons, the crackling of the fire in the kitchen, the distant sound of a record player playing an old song, with hisses and glitches. The Americans watched them, but without haste. One of them served generous portions, Another filled glasses with fresh water. No one seemed in a hurry to finish. The women began to move, one by one, driven by hunger and curiosity. The cook served each one personally, cutting thick slices of turkey, pouring mashed potatoes, placing colorful vegetables on the side. When one of them tried to refuse a second roll, he shook his head, smiling, and placed another one on her plate. "Plenty," he said simply, and she understood without needing a translation. The weight of the plate in her hands felt almost sacred. It was real food, food that you smelled before you ate. The steam rose and warmed her face, and the aroma of meat mixed with salt, milk, and butter made her stomach contract. One of the prisoners, thin and deep-eyed, sat down slowly, without touching the food. The linen napkin on her lap was too white, too clean. She smoothed it with trembling fingers and waited. Others did the same. They sat down, but did not eat. The silence was heavy but different from before. Not the silence of obedience, but of astonishment. The lamps illuminated their marked faces, their wounded hands, their eyes that still did not know if this was a trick, a test, or some kind of deception of fate. The sergeant walked slowly between the tables. He passed a woman who was still holding her fork in mid-air, not daring to begin. He said nothing, just served a little more mashed potatoes on her plate and walked away. It was an almost imperceptible kindness, but it changed everything. In war, gestures like this carry the weight of miracle. The record player changed tracks. Now it was a slow melody, something between a march and a lament. The Americans also began to sit down at separate tables and eat in silence, respecting the moment. Outside, the wind blew against the windows, bringing with it snowflakes that hit the glass like small rhythmic beats. Inside, the heat made their cheeks flush, and the air smelled of spices and something more subtle, perhaps peace, even if temporary. The translator, who watched everything in silence, noticed something curious. The prisoners' faces were changing. Their previously tense features began to soften. There was a strange humanity there, the same humanity that the regime they had served claimed did not exist in the enemy. It was as if, suddenly, the world had become a little less black and white. She looked around and wondered how many of those women, including herself, had believed every word of the propaganda that had led them to war, about superiority, hatred, duty. And now, faced with full plates, served by hands that did not hate them, that belief was beginning to melt away, silently, like snow in the sun. The Americans didn't say much. They just smiled, served, picked up fallen cutlery, filled glasses. And that generous silence, that absence of imposition, was more disconcerting than any speech. For women accustomed to brutality, scarcity, and constant vigilance, that environment represented a rupture. It was a wound and a cure at the same time. One of them, the youngest, raised her glass and saw the cold white milk swaying inside. She hadn't seen real milk in years. The reflection of the light on the glass transported her for a moment to her home, to a small kitchen in Bremen, where her mother would place a glass just like hers next to her bread before school. The memory rose in her throat with the same weight as longing. She took a sip, and the sweet, clean, fresh taste caused an involuntary tremor. She quickly put the glass down, the sharp sound against the table echoing like a snap. Some turned to look, but she kept her eyes down, focused on not crying. At the next table, another woman picked up her fork. She cut a small piece of turkey. Steam rose, and the smell of seasoning and melted fat seemed unbelievably familiar. She put the piece in her mouth and chewed slowly. The flavor exploded in waves. Salt, meat, butter. The warmth went down her throat and ignited something forgotten. She looked at her companions and, without saying anything, nodded. Little by little, the others began to eat. First slowly, as if they were afraid it was an illusion. Then faster, with real hunger. The sound of cutlery returned, discreet, almost respectful. The women chewed in silence, and little by little, the hall began to take on a different kind of life. The cook watched from afar, leaning against the wall. His apron was stained with flour, his arms crossed, his gaze a mixture of relief and melancholy. It was clear that this was not just a meal. It was a gesture, a way of saying, without words, that even in the midst of war, human decency could survive. And outside, the snow continued to fall, slowly covering the fences, the roofs, the tracks left by boots. The camp, seen from the outside, looked the same. But inside, amid the clatter of spoons and the soft sound of music, something was changing, something invisible, profound, irreversible. The sound of cutlery diminished as the plates were emptied, and for a moment the dining hall was suspended in a kind of reverent silence. Outside, the wind blew softly, and snowflakes fell slowly against the windows, as if the world had also decided to pause. The heat made the air almost dense, full of smells: butter, meat, potatoes, spices. The women were no longer talking. Some chewed slowly. Others just held their forks, staring at their plates as if they still needed to convince themselves that this was real. The Americans continued to move discreetly, clearing empty platters, filling glasses, exchanging silent glances. That environment, which on any other day would have been just a functional space, seemed to have become a place where time stood still. Then the cook returned. He was pushing a cart covered with a white towel. On top of it were 3 pies, the golden edges, the warm smell of cinnamon and cloves spreading through the air like a vivid memory of home. When the man removed the towel, a murmur ran through the tables. One of the pies was apple, another cherry, the third pumpkin, and their scent, mixed with the heat, brought something that none of those women were ready to face. The cook, with a tired smile, began to cut the slices and serve them one by one. The first piece was placed in front of the woman from Dusseldorf, the former supervisor who, hours earlier, had insisted that everyone wait, suspicious. The steam rising from the golden filling touched her face, and her eyes closed for a moment, as if her body had reacted before her mind. She held the fork, hesitated, and finally cut a small piece. The pie yielded easily, the crisp crust opening to reveal the soft, shiny filling. The sweet smell of apple, mixed with butter and sugar, was almost unbearable. The fork reached her mouth, and the moment the flavor hit her, she stopped. Her whole body froze, and her hand began to shake. That simple taste, sweet, warm, comforting, cut through layers of memories and struck her heart like a silent confession. The fork fell onto the plate with a brief, metallic sound. She tried to pick it up again, but her fingers wouldn't obey. Her breathing became short. Across the table, the young teacher from Leipzig watched. She had her own fork suspended, not daring to continue. The older woman lowered her head, her shoulders shaking slightly, and only then did the young woman realize she was crying. She cried in a restrained, soundless way, her hands flat on the white tablecloth. That was the first crack. The dam broke in silence, and then everything came at once. The teacher put her fork aside, and the tears began to fall. There was no logical reason, no words. It was the body reacting to something the mind could not translate. The pie, the music, the warm light, all of it formed such an absurd and human combination that it became unbearable. Soon others began to cry as well, first silently, then openly, until the sound of choked voices filled the entire space. The noise of chairs scraping, heavy breathing, collective sobbing. Those women, who for months had lived under control, fear, and obedience, collapsed. They cried as if purging something old, hidden, impossible to name. It was crying coming from everywhere at once, from hunger, from loss, from shame, from memories of home, from the unexpected gesture of kindness that overwhelmed them. The soldiers looked at each other, not knowing what to do. The young sergeant took a step forward, concerned, but the older cook held him by the shoulder and shook his head. "Let them be," he murmured, and so they remained. The cook, arms crossed, the sergeant motionless, and the others just watching as the sound of crying filled the dining hall. The music was still playing on the record player, a cheerful, inappropriate, almost cruel melody. One of the soldiers got up, crossed the hall, and lifted the needle. The silence that followed was absolute. Without the music, the sound of crying became more intimate. You could hear the radiators crackling, the snow creaking on the windows, and the ragged breathing of dozens of women who had long forgotten what it meant to cry in public. Crying was weakness. It was dangerous. But there, at that moment, no one tried to hold back. The tears were not just for sadness, they were also for a strange kind of relief, a breach in the armor that each had built. They cried because the food was too good, because the gesture was too simple, and because it didn't fit with what they had been taught. They cried because the propaganda said that the enemy was barbaric, cold, soulless, and yet here they were, serving warm pie with gentle hands. They cried because feeling gratitude was almost treason. One of them, with light eyes and a hardened expression, wiped her face with the white napkin and looked at him in surprise. The fabric was soft, clean, and the touch against her skin only increased her lack of control. The mundane gesture of wiping away tears with something so pure and clean had a devastating symbolic weight. She brought the napkin to her face again, covered her eyes, and cried harder. The woman from Dusseldorf was still motionless. The plate in front of her was half-eaten, the fork now firmly in her hand. When the sobbing subsided, she lifted her face. Tears marked her face, but there was something different in her eyes, a sad lucidity, a new understanding. She took another piece of cake and ate it slowly. The taste was the same, sweet, warm, comforting. But now there was also the taste of something more bitter, the recognition that hatred could not withstand a human gesture. The cook watched from a distance, wiping his hands on his apron, trying to hide his emotion. One of the soldiers, a redhead, passed between the tables with a jug of milk, and without saying a word, filled glasses. The simple gesture brought new tears. That milk, cold and white, represented more than nutrition. It was a memory. It was purity. It was the most concrete symbol that there was a world outside the fences, and that this world could still be generous. The crying lasted for several minutes. Then, silence slowly returned. Some women remained with their faces covered. Others stared fixedly at the table. The sound of breathing merged with the crackling of the lamps, and in that emptiness of sound, something shifted within each of them. It was as if the weight of an entire narrative, years of fear, indoctrination, anger, began to crack, letting in a light that they didn't know if they wanted to see. From the perspective of someone watching the scene without context, it might have looked like just a group of prisoners moved by a meal. But inside those women, what was happening was much greater. It was a silent moral crisis. Each spoonful, each kind gesture, was a crack in the structure of certainties that underpinned what they had learned to call truth. Outside, the war was still raging, but inside that cafeteria, it was already beginning to lose its meaning. The cook, the sergeant, the red-haired soldier, all remained silent, respecting that moment as if they knew, somehow, that they were facing something that no longer belonged to war, but to memory. A fragment of humanity preserved amid the chaos. The record player fell silent, the steam dissolved, and the cafeteria returned to its state of rest. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the tracks left in the courtyard. The prisoners, now calmer, continued to eat what was left of the pie, some with tears still streaming down their faces, others with a new, fragile, but real serenity. No words were spoken, but they all knew that this would be one of those days they would never forget. A day when the enemy gave them back something that the war had stolen, the ability to feel, and perhaps, more than any speech, more than any victory, this was what really began to defeat hatred. When silence fell again, it was not the same as before. There was no longer any rigidity, nor that metallic weight that marked the days in the camp. It was a full silence, dense with meaning, with emotions that still echoed among the tables. The smell of warm pie and fresh coffee mingled with the air coming in through the windows, where the cold tried to enter, but could not break through the warmth that still spread throughout the hall. The cook collected the dishes slowly, one by one, as if he did not want to interrupt what remained of that truce. The women watched, some with a lost look, others with their hands still trembling on the white napkins. The sergeant, the same one who had opened the door in the morning, approached one of the tables and began to fold the tablecloths carefully, as if each movement had symbolic weight. Next to him, the red-haired soldier, the youngest of the group, entered carrying a wicker basket. When he set it down on the table, the air seemed to change again. Inside the basket were oranges, round, vibrant fruits, impossibly alive in the middle of the Montana winter. The contrast between that intense orange and the gray of the world outside was almost painful. The women stared, incredulous. Some leaned forward, as if they didn't trust their own eyes. The red-haired soldier held out his hand and said something in English. The translator whispered, "He's saying, 'Happy Easter.'" None of them responded. They just watched as he approached each table, offering an orange to each prisoner, one by one, with the same care one would offer a fragile gift. The woman from Dusseldorf was the first to take one. The fruit was cold to the touch, heavy, and when she pressed her thumb against the peel, a spray of citrus oil spread through the air, strong, sharp, sweet. The smell of orange filled the entire cafeteria, mingling with the aroma of pie, coffee, and snow. It was a smell that spoke of home, of forgotten summers, of freedom. One woman began to laugh softly. Another brought the fruit to her face, breathing deeply as if she wanted to keep that scent inside her. The soldier smiled, a shy smile, and repeated his greeting. "Happy Easter!" The translation came again, and the sound of those words seemed different now, as if Easter had regained its meaning. The women nodded, some still silent, others murmuring a shy thank you. And in that gesture, so simple, so unarmed, something was completed. Time seemed suspended. Outside, heavy snowflakes fell, covering the fences, the roofs, the footprints in the courtyard. Inside, warmth spread through the hands holding the fruit, through the tears that had not yet completely dried, through the eyes that no longer looked with fear. Shortly after, the cook announced in a low voice that lunch was over, that they could rest or return to their tents if they wanted to. No one got up immediately. The movement was slow, as if they were all afraid of breaking a spell. They got up one by one, holding the oranges to their chests as if they were relics. Some approached the cook and, in broken English, tried to thank him. He responded only with a nod and an embarrassed look, wiping his hands on his apron, perhaps to hide his own emotion. When they left, the cold air enveloped them again. But this time the cold didn't seem the same. The courtyard was covered with a thin layer of clean snow, and smoke from the cafeteria rose in gentle spirals. The wind carried the distant sound of the record player, which someone had turned back on, now playing a slow, almost melancholic song. The women walked slowly, silently, back to their tents. The sun, timidly, tried to break through the clouds. The ground creaked under their damp shoes. Each one held her orange carefully, protecting it as if carrying a memory. It was more than a fruit. It was the materialization of something they had forgotten, the possibility of kindness in times of darkness. Inside the tents it was cooler, but the smell of oranges began to fill the space. One by one, the women sat down on the iron beds and began to peel the fruit. The peels opened in long spirals, and the scent spread, sweet, vivid, intense. Some saved pieces for later, others ate them right there, with their eyes closed, savoring them slowly, letting the juice run through their fingers. One of them, the young teacher, took a piece of paper and began to write. She didn't know if the letter would arrive, if there was still someone to receive it. Even so, she wrote. She talked about lunch, the turkey, the cold milk, the pie, and the oranges. She wrote about the soldiers, the cook, the sergeant, the red-haired boy. She said that they all cried, and that no one told them to stop, that on that day, the enemy had given them back a piece of their lost humanity. When she finished, she carefully folded the paper and hid it under her pillow. Outside, the snow was falling again. Inside, someone began to sing softly, perhaps a childhood song, perhaps a prayer. The others remained silent, listening, and a strange calm took over the room. The sound of the wind mingled with the singing and the citrus scent, creating something that none of them could explain later. That night, the woman from Dusseldorf lay down staring at the ceiling, her body still warm, her soul confused. On the windowsill, the untouched orange rested, bathed in a pale light coming from outside. She thought about everything she had experienced up to that point, the orders, the beliefs, the words they had repeated to them about the enemy. And she also thought about the red-haired soldier's smile, the happy Easter, uttered without irony, the clean napkin, the apple pie. It all seemed impossible, and at the same time, more true than any speech she had heard before. Sleep came slowly. Before closing her eyes, she wondered if, the next day, everything would go back to the way it was before. Maybe yes, maybe no. But something inside her knew that even if the hard work started again, something had changed forever. Because on that day, the boundaries between winners and losers dissolved for a few hours, and in the warmth of an Easter lunch, what remained was only what was human on both sides. Today, looking back, what happened in that prison camp is more than an isolated episode of World War II. It is a reminder that compassion can flourish in the most unlikely places, and that war, however great, never completely erases the ability of one human being to recognize another. Sometimes, a single gesture, a plate of food, a warm pie, an orange offered with sincerity, is enough to dismantle an entire ideology. If you had been there, in that cafeteria, faced with that unexpected gesture of kindness, what do you think might have been different? War? Faith? Hatred? Would any of these things have changed in you? Leave a comment with your thoughts on this episode and what it awakens in you. Like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel to follow other real stories that reveal what war tried to hide. The unbreakable power of human kindness.